Good morning and welcome to the 11th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. And as usual, can I remind everyone at this point to switch off any mobile phones, Blackberries and other wireless devices, as they can often interfere with our sound system. Our first item on the agenda today is a decision on whether to take item 5 in private. Item 5 is the committee's approach to the NHS Board's budget scrutiny. Can I have the committee's agreement that that is an item that we can take in private? Thank you for that. We now move to agenda item number 2, which is to consider a negative Scottish statutory instruments. SSI is SSI 2013-96, the National Health Service Optical Charges and Payments Scotland Amendment Regulations 2013. There have been no motions to annul. The Subordinate Legislation Committee has, however, drawn the instrument to the attention of the Parliament on reporting grounds. Do members have any comments? No comments from members. I therefore put the question, which is on SSI 2013-96, as previously laid out, that the committee has no recommendations to make. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Agenda item number 3, Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill evidence session, which is our second evidence session on this bill. And can we, as we normally do in round table events, can I introduce myself, Duncan McNeill, MSP for Greater Inverclyde, convener of the Health and Sport Committee, and to my right.
Morning, Tam Bailey, Scotland's Commissioner for Children and Young People.
Good morning, Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
Good morning, Alan Miller, Chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission.
Good morning, Duncan Wilson, Head of Strategy and Legal at the Scottish Human Rights Commission.
Good morning, Kathleen Marshall, and I was one of the Commissioners on the Time to be Heard pilot.
Gil Patterson, Member for Clydebank and Mulgai.
Mark MacDonald, Member for North East Scotland.
Jennifer Davidson, the Director of the Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children in Scotland.
David Torrance, Member for Cardiff Constituency.
Moira Hawthorne, Researcher at the Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children in Scotland.
Lynette Milne, Member for North East Scotland.
Donny Lyons, I'm Chief Executive of the Mental Welfare Commission.
Aileen MacLeod, Member for the South of Scotland.
I'm Lucy Fenn, I'm the HR Manager at the Mental Welfare Commission, and I'm Interim Project Manager for setting up the NCF under the Commission.
Thank you for that, and welcome to you all. And we move to Bob Doris for our first question. And as normal in these situations, we will do our best to do more listening than asking questions, and hopefully we can see that flow. Bob, thanks.
Thanks, Convener. As everyone knows, this committee has been tasked with looking at details within the bill we're scrutinising for the National Confidentiality Forum. This is based on the Time to be Heard pilot in 2010. Can I ask those giving evidence today whether or not they think the Time to be Heard pilot was a good basis in which to base the National Confidentiality Forum, and to what extent do you think the National Confidentiality Forum can meet the needs and the wishes of victims of abuse?
Anyone want to pick that up?
I'd be happy to jump in.
Yes, please, Jennifer.
I think the question is a really important question to be asking. And while I appreciate that the role of the Health and Sport Committee here is to be considering this particular National Confidential Forum, if the wider purpose of really for Scotland, of all those who have a role to play, if our wider purpose is to ensure that the needs of survivors are met, I would say that a portion of those needs may well be met by the National Confidential Forum based on Time to be Heard. However, the important question is also that we need to be looking at the wider strategy for all of those needs of survivors. And I would suggest to you that perhaps this is a very narrow way of meeting the needs of survivors, and that indeed there may need to be a more effective strategy about all the needs before we move forward on a National Confidential Forum.
Yes, Kathleen.
Yes, I think based on my experience being part of the Time to Be Heard pilot, it certainly did seem to be a very positive experience for the people who attended, for most of the people who attended. I'm very aware, like Jennifer and like many of the witnesses who spoke at your last session, that there is a wider agenda and that there are some people for whom, in fact, the lack of a justice component is for them a health and well-being aspect, because being denied justice is to them a very emotional issue. I think it's quite difficult on the basis of the experience we had in Time to Be Heard to gauge how much that other justice issue will become prominent, because most of the people we heard had never been involved in any of these discussions before about justice and were at a different part of the time scale in terms of coming to terms with what happened to you and identifying what you want to happen. I think a lot of the survivors groups have been involved in it for a long time and have reached that stage where they're able to reflect on it more and to look to the more challenging justice aspects. Many of the people who came to speak to us just wanted to tell their experiences, at that point. That was what was important to them. But that's not to say that later on they might be able to engage with the wider agenda for something more. So I do think that the wider agenda is very important for many people, and it may be important for more people than we can tell at the moment on the basis of the stage they were at when they came to speak to us.
Alan.
Thanks very much, Convener. Yes, I would echo pretty much what Jennifer and Kathleen have been saying. As members of the committee might know from some of the papers you have before you, the Scottish Human Rights Commission was requested by the Scottish Government some years ago to present a framework for both acknowledgement and accountability. And we looked at international human rights law, domestic human rights law and international best practice, and presented a comprehensive framework in which both acknowledgement and accountability could be met through various initiatives that could be taken. And as members may know, there's an interaction process now underway, jointly led by the Commission and CELSIS, and involving survivors, the government, the local authorities, religious orders, the Bishops' Conference, etc., which is exploring other means of providing access to justice and redress for these survivors, as well as the obligation of the state to carry out proper investigations to learn the lessons, to make sure there can be no repetition, and to ensure that those who should be held to account for serious abuse should be. So that we would see the National Confidential Forum as, for some survivors, meeting some needs of satisfaction, of being able to possibly and hopefully have some therapeutic element, although that may be contested by others. But it's part of a broader package that needs to be taken forward.
Anyone else?
I just want to add to that, because I actually did the part of the evaluation of Time to Be Heard that Kathleen referred to, and I'm one of the principal consultants in the interaction which Alan has referred to. And again, there were some very positive components of Time to Be Heard that were fed back by participants. But again, the feedback is that there are a wider range of remedies which people are actually seeking. So it's difficult to see the National Confidential Forum in isolation without beginning to look at the other remedies that would make up some of that, the reparation, access to records. So we really need to see it in terms of the bigger picture, and that was part of the feedback.
Any other response? No? Bob, you want to?
Yes, I think I thank people for acknowledging that there needs to be a wider strategy, but you'll appreciate we are scrutinising a very specific part of legislation, so there's no attempt for the committee to ignore the wider strategy, so we've got a duty to obviously explore the details in the bill that we need to scrutinise. One of the issues that was raised in evidence before recess was that for those who get benefit under the Time to Be Heard pilot, was people start to address issues that they may not have looked at for many, many years, and the need for ongoing, I think, therapeutic or counselling support on a long-term basis. And there was a a feeling, I think it's fair to say, amongst witnesses that they weren't sure how long-term any counselling support would be. So I think I would like to ask what you think the needs are in terms of someone who wants to engage with the National Confidentiality Forum, in terms of how the state and the authorities should make sure there's a long-term commitment in terms of counselling and therapy, not just for a number of weeks, but I think, as we heard before Easter, for a number of months or perhaps even years. Any views on that?
Kathleen, and then Moya.
First of all, while acknowledging the wider strategy, I wouldn't like to see the confidential forum being held up for that, because that's going to take a long time. I think there are people who need this now. But I do take this point about the ongoing support, and the availability of support was something we were very, very aware of, you know, when we were going through the Time to Be Heard pilot. We did have the in-care survivors support available. I think it's important that that support continues. What we don't know is, you know, that we had the evaluations and we had the feedback. Obviously, it was sort of time limited. I think what would be really valuable would be that when the National Confidential Forum was set up, that it was made clear to people who'd been to Time to Be Heard that they weren't barred from coming forward again, because they didn't have such an opportunity for coming back to reinforce, to add more information to what they said before. But also, I think they would be a very valuable source of information on what their experience was after it. And I think some of the witnesses last time talked about there being an initial euphoria when you have got something off your chest that you've really held on to for so long and sometimes not told anybody. And I think we experienced that during the forum, that people went out with a spring in their step. It was amazing. And I think, I'm sure that for most people, the beneficial effects of that would continue. But I think the people who've been through the pilot would be a very valuable source of information on the kind and extent and length of support that should continue. And I would certainly support what the witnesses said at the last session about the need for ongoing support, especially that the survivor is able to choose. I think that's an important aspect.
I think I'd want to back that up, because for some of the people who came forward to Time to Be Heard, some people had never actually recognised their experience as abusive in the first place. Some people had actually gone through their lives and never actually told the rest of their family about the experience. So you've gone to Time to be heard, and as Kathleen's saying, coming out with a spring in your step. But in actual fact, events after that, for example, the Savile inquiry, I know, or the evidence that's coming forth there, has brought that up again for a number of people, because again it flags it up. So it's items out there in the media, but also as life moves on and there are life-changing events, again this can come up. So I think it's again about the access to ongoing counselling and support, but of their choice. We've referred to In-Care Survivor Service Scotland, and it's a superb service, I mean, no doubt. But survivors have told me they would like to be able to choose the service and the counselling approach that they would want. So yes, the need for ongoing support, but of their choice and at the time of their choice.
Tom?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're talking about ongoing support for people that have been through the kind of experiences that are going to be the focus of the National Confidential Forum, it's as long as it takes. And what we have to do is to make sure that that is available for as long as it takes. And if you draw a parallel with children who've been through abusive experiences or traumatising experiences, we wouldn't put a time bar on how long those children receive support and assistance. And I think it's likewise. It's human beings that we're dealing with who in many, many instances have had this bottled up, have not felt the confidence to share. I think the approach on this should be for as long as it takes.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I'll come back in later, convener, but I'd like to thank the witnesses for putting some of that on the record. I think it's important. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Nanette?
I'd like to maybe follow on with regard to those who are eligible to take part in the forum. I mean, Kathleen Marshall, you said that people who've taken part in the pilot shouldn't be barred from coming in, but people under 18, for instance, are barred. People in foster care are barred. I'd be interested to know what people's views are on these particular aspects.
Yes, carry on.
I think for people under 18 there are specific issues because we've got other responsibilities. There should be other routes for these young people to address the issues about when they were looked after. So I don't have an issue with that barrier to the National Confidential Forum, although I haven't heard anyone give an argument for it, so I'd be prepared to listen to arguments for it. We recommended that it should be very widely available to people in institutional care and educational institutions and foster care. And I think actually as you work through the decades, you're going to come to situations where there are people who have spent periods in institutional care and in foster care and in and out. And so if the Confidential Forum is in a position where they're able to listen to some parts of that survivor's experience and not others, then that could be slightly tricky. Also, I think foster care is an area where we've got the most to learn. And the other areas like education and health, where these abuse issues haven't arisen to the degree that they have in places like children's residential homes. So as a matter of principle, I'd want it to be available as widely as possible. I do take the point, I see on the face of the bill, it doesn't talk about educational institutions. I'm not sure the extent to which they would come into care services or how many of them would be excluded by the bill. It does seem to exclude foster care. I would like it to be possible to include that at some point. And I know there are ways in which the bill can be amended by order subject to affirmative resolution, but I feel that even if it didn't start out with foster care and all of the other ones, it should be possible to include them because people have suffered as much there. And in recent years, it's sometimes very difficult to tell the difference between a large foster home and a small children's home, in terms of the number of people and the training and the skill of the foster carers. So I think that division becomes artificial, and if anyone aged over 18 is eligible, then you're moving into that area where these divisions between categories of care become more difficult to sustain.
Duncan, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I suppose on the first question, the eligibility of people under 18, very much echo what Kathleen said insofar as the Commission noted that we haven't really seen in the explanatory notes or the policy memorandum an explanation, and that's what we would be looking for, is that in principle a process like this and justice and remedies should be open and indeed adapted to include everyone, and any departure from that should be carefully justified. So there should be a reasonable justification as to why we would exclude blanket exclusion of anyone under the age of 18. And I note that in written evidence, the Care Inspectorate, for example, suggests that there should be consideration to include those over 16, given their special status in our law. Further, the Commission has proposed in the human rights framework and in our written submission that consideration be given to opening the process to others who were indirectly affected, so surviving relatives, for example, that there could be benefit in opening up the process to others who were not directly affected but very strongly indirectly affected, and that certainly would accord with international human rights standards as well.
Indirectly affected, but what do you mean? Are you talking about parents? Or?
Well, it might, just to give some examples, it could be close relatives of people who are no longer alive, right, who may have taken their own lives, for example, following this process, or for other reasons are unable to participate directly.
Okay. Anyone else who you want to respond to, Nanette?
I would back up both Duncan and Kathleen on the point about those over 16. But I'd like to particularly make a point about foster care, because historically in Scotland we're in a different position. We sometimes look to Ireland and Canada, but in actual fact in Scotland we're quite unusual in that we had a higher percentage of our children historically were placed in foster care. And while the Clyde report back in 1946 was recommending foster care, in actual fact what happened to a number of children who were what was known as boarded out was they actually went to some of the crofting communities and were used as cheap labour. So while people might perceive foster care as a positive experience, that in actual fact has not been what has happened, and we know that from historians likes of Lynn Abrams. In actual fact, at Celsius, Professor Kendrick and I have received some funding to work in partnership with the In-Care Abuse Survivor Service to do a scoping study on including those in foster care. So we've started that, but we literally have just started that a couple of weeks ago. But our strong feeling is that they should be included. We know also from some historical accounts in the media, going back to the 1940s, that again children in foster care were being abused as well. So we know from historians and from the media. So I would strongly recommend that it should be included.
Extended, the sort of like kinship care, sort of more informal foster care, should that be included as well, do you think, or interested in your views on that?
Do you want to pick that one up, Duncan?
I was just going to say that there can be value in a process like this for anyone who's survived abuse. But there is also a distinction in terms of state responsibility, where the state has placed someone in care, and one of the drivers for a process of acknowledgement and accountability should be to look at where the state has failed to prevent abuse or protect children from a real risk of abuse that they knew of or ought to have known of, and that's clearly stronger where the state has taken responsibility for placing someone in care.
Tom?
Just 2 points. I think it's too restrictive in terms of residential care for all of the reasons that have been mentioned, and I think it is important about those placements that are in some way engineered or are the responsibility of the state, either through state provision or regulatory bodies, and I think there's been written evidence to that effect, that it can become quite a wide and should be a much wider scope. On the age issue, regardless of where you draw the age, there are anomalies, and there will be 60 particular anomalies in our legislation with 16, 17-year-olds. Sometimes they're regarded as adults, sometimes they're regarded as children. So wherever the line is drawn, there's going to be difficulty there. In fact, if we raise, as I hope we do, the average age of children in care beyond the age of 18, then the National Confidential Forum is going to have to take that into account of children who are young people who are in care, who would have access, whether you draw at age 16 or 18. But I think there's a bigger point here, and that is that we currently have children right now who don't have the confidence to come forward, who for whatever reasons are not able to actually have the confidence to say, here are things that are happening, here are my experiences. And I think one of the debates that should be had in setting up with the National Confidential Forum is, so what about children right now? Children under the age of 18, right the way down. Because it's been mentioned, Savil's just been mentioned, the experience of Savile is children do not have the confidence to raise issues, they don't have the confidence to share information. That's happening right now. And one of the benefits of this discussion or debate is that we should actually be focusing on children in the here and now. I'm not suggesting that we expand the forum to all age groups, but I do think the principles of it stand, and that we should actually be attending to children right now, regardless of how well our child protection systems are operating. They are missing children who don't have the confidence to come forward. We should be using the opportunity just now to home in on that.
Anyone else from a panel of witnesses want to respond, Kathleen?
First of all, I'll just echo what Tam says, and I think we should be reflecting on what's happening in children today and what it's going to help them to recount what's happening to them. I just want to get back to this issue about being placed by the state. Now, interestingly, in the pilot, of course, the Quarriers one, they weren't all placed by the state. Some of them had been placed by their families, you know, so that sometimes that division can be artificial. Also, you know, when we had the idea of voluntary care in more recent decades, some children would have been classed as in care on a voluntary basis, whereas in fact it wasn't necessarily completely. It was trying not to make it compulsory in partnership with parents, etc. So I wouldn't want the business about it being provided by the state to be excluding people from involvement in this. There are going to be some grey areas. For example, I think kinship care that was mentioned is a very interesting one, because it really is, whereas we're regarding it now more as a category, it's emerging as a category in law, it's really been the kind of the extended family, and I think there is a question there about how far you go into the family side, and I don't have an answer to that. We also have the issues about private foster care. Private foster care, you know, where people have placed children with unrelated people. Foster care for the state's duty is more of a kind of at a distance supervisory rather than placing them. So I don't have an answer, you know, a clear answer to that, but I think these are issues that we should be exploring. And I do think it's important that the act that comes out of this is flexible enough to be able to extend it to categories of these other categories where we've actually had a chance to think it through, so that no one is going to be permanently excluded from it.
Okay. Gil,
it's on the age, convener.
It's on the eligibility.
Yeah,
that's fine then, because
one of the reasons that the government give for picking the age of 18 is there might be current issues with people in an institution at the present time that might be deemed as criminal, I would suspect. So therefore there might be an anomaly where the NCF couldn't really, it wouldn't be appropriate for the NCF to be engaged at that. So that's one of the reasons that the likelihood is that a child over 18 would be out of the institution and therefore more likely not to be a current case. So that's basic. I was wondering what the panel thought about that.
Yeah, thanks, Gil.
There's 2 points on that. We currently have children or young people who are looked after, children with disabilities, for instance, beyond the age of 18. And we have ambitions in Scotland to be better at taking care of children who are in care and not encouraging them to be leaving too early. And in fact, we've got a bill that has just will be published later this week, where it's proposing that support is offered to young people up to the age of 25. So I think the direction of travel should be that young people are maintained within care establishments for longer. So even a bar at 18 is going to have to address that if we are to realise other ambitions, which is to make sure that we treat our young people in care more like the young people who are leaving home in this time and place, because it's in its mid-20s and yet most of our young people leave care still aged 16, 17. And we've got ambitions to increase that, quite rightly, I think. So the framing of the bill is going to have to address that issue regardless of where it draws that age line.
Jennifer.
I absolutely concur with what Tam has just said, and I'd like to go back to your question because I think it raises some serious questions about the role of the forum in relation to acts that may be criminal. And so just briefly, I would recommend that the committee would look closely to ensure that the powers that the National Confidential Forum would have would be sufficient to address issues that are raised that have criminal implications.
I should say at this point that the committee received this morning a letter from the Minister, Michael Matheson. I've asked the clerks to get a copy so you can be provided with it. And it relates to our last evidence session and eligibility to participate. And it's difficult to summarise. I've sent for copies, but it points out, it seems to point out that it's intended that anyone who has past experience, not current experience, and an age threshold is considered prudent for those experience not to be current. I'm sure you will appreciate that the NCF would not be an appropriate mechanism to address the experiences including abuse and neglect of people currently in institutional care. Now, a response, you know, but I've sent for a copy of the letter anyway, and you'll have that, and if you need to return to it before we finish up today, I'll be happy to do that. Kathleen Marshall, and I think, Tom, you want to come back on that.
I think the age issue, and I think the 16-18 is an interesting one, because the duties for child protection, passing on information and all that sort of thing tend to go up to 16 at the moment, but in many ways are creeping up to 18. So we want to avoid having a gap for 16 and 17-year-olds. One of the issues, I think, which struck me about this is, can we promise under 16s particularly a national confidential forum? If 16-year-olds, under 16-year-olds came to the forum, there would be more issues about passing information on and doing something with it, and more moral and legal imperatives, I would say, to do that than you would have with adults. So in a sense, would we be misleading children and young people by inviting them to relate their experiences to a national confidential forum, if that's what we're calling it, when we know we're not going to be able to keep that confidential? I think those sorts of issues would be highlighted. And that, for me, makes me think about, that there must be a mechanism to encourage young people who are currently in the care system or who have been in it more recently to be able to speak freely about their experiences in the same way. Whether that should be the same mechanism that we're calling a confidential forum for adults is something that I'm not sure about, but willing to debate, because I think some of those issues will come. I mean, most of the people we spoke to, because Quarriers stopped the residential care component in the 1980s, there was less likelihood of people being identified as abusers who were now currently in contact with children, all that sort of thing. Even when you go to the other, anyone over 18, you're more likely to have issues that you're going to have to take forward, that you're going to have to report. But I think they are heightened for people who are currently and legally children for whom we have a duty to protect. So that's my thinking about whether this is the right forum for them, or whether there should be something else that performs a similar function, but possibly with different expectations.
Something else, Tom Bailey?
Yeah, that's the very reason that I said earlier. I'm not suggesting that the National Confidential Forum should cover all ages, but the principles of it we have to look at, and we have to find ways of creating confidential space for those children that are currently in abusive or traumatising situations. So I think there's a further debate to be had about how we actually address that for children in the here and now. On the response to the young people who are currently in care settings not getting access to the National Confidential Forum, that's going to have to be addressed by the government, because they've got other policies which are encouraging young people to stay in care for longer. So like I said earlier, it doesn't matter where you draw it, 16, 18, we are looking at young people staying in care settings, supportive care settings, for longer periods. So that is going to have to be addressed in any case.
Anyone else on eligibility? Thanks for that. Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to touch on another issue which was raised during the first panel of witnesses, and that was around support services for those attending the NCF. The role of advocacy was brought up during that session, and the point I made to the witnesses is that advocacy can have a number of different definitions. There's the statutory definition of advocacy, which is an advocacy organisation. There's the role for people to be given empowerment to self-advocate, and there are also people who may wish to have a trusted individual advocate on their behalf who might not fit a legislative definition of advocacy. So I guess my question would be, how does the panel see the provisions within the bill for support for those attending the NCF and do they see ways that those might be either improved or modified?
Donald?
Yes, it's a good point. What's in the bill is only part of the story there, of course, because the forum will have arrangements set up whereby people who come along to give evidence will have an initial briefing session, initial support, initial understanding of what it is that they're coming to do, and then support afterwards. And there are individuals built in to what's been proposed for the forum. That will be their responsibility to do that. Everything else that you have mentioned is something that would be absolutely open to anybody who comes along to give evidence to the forum. Bearing in mind in particular that when you have somebody who's identified as having an existing mental health problem, there is an absolute right of advocacy to independent advocacy laid out within the 2003 Act, and that's not just for people who are subject to compulsory measures.
I don't know if anybody else wants to. I do have a follow-up, but I wonder if any other witnesses.
Does anyone else wishes to respond? Moira?
Yes, there was actually just a point of clarification that came out in the time to be heard in respect of advocacy, and it's about explaining the preparation beforehand, because I found there were 2 people out of the 6 I interviewed that misinterpreted confidential forum meant that they had to keep the fact they were going confidential, and if they hadn't been aware they could take a family member. So that really was very much Donnie's point about a thorough briefing beforehand, so as people are very, very clear on that. And I think a second issue for me is we're extending this out to people who have learning difficulties, who have been in long-stay hospitals, and I think that may well meet quite a substantial piece of preparation beforehand, because we may well be talking about people who are non-verbal, who've got communication difficulties. So I think, sorry.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. There's also a role for making sure that speech and language therapy assistance is available for people in that situation as well. And all of these are things that the forum will be doing and will be considering to enable maximum participation. Because you have to, if you don't do that, then there's a danger that you indirectly discriminate against some people. We'll certainly be very, very keen as an organisation, obviously, that people with learning disability have got the opportunity to have enough support and information to allow them to participate.
Jennifer.
Just a comment on that. I think we'll need to also be thinking about how the information about the forum in the first place can reach these people, given the ways in which they may or may not be able to be communicating. So that would clearly be a key point in relation to support, even just to allow and facilitate people to be coming to the forum.
Mark?
Yeah. I think the point I was going to make in follow-up, convener, was around identification of those who would require that level of support. Obviously, as Donnie's mentioned, there are some who have a statutory right already embedded, but there will be those who perhaps would still have a need that lies outside of that. But I think I have a relative amount of confidence that what you're saying is that your view would be that there are enough, I suppose you could call, safeguards in place in terms of the preliminary interview briefings, etc., that would allow for that kind of need to be identified at an early stage, so that people, when they arrived at the NCF, would be in a position that the support they required had been identified and provided.
Very much the intention.
Okay, thank you.
I think I had Aileen.
Thanks very much, convener. I just wanted to raise another issue that had come up in our last evidence session. Obviously, the bill proposals provide for the National Confidential Forum to be set up as a mandatory committee of the Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland. So I'd be, first of all, interested in the views of witnesses around the table about proposals for the forum to be housed within the Mental Welfare Commission, but also perhaps more specifically to Lucy Finn and Donald Lyons, who are sitting on either side of me, from the Mental Welfare Commission, on how the Commission as an organisation plans to ensure the forum's independence, given that it's housed within a public body.
Donald?
I'll start and pass on to Lucy. I was interested in reading the last session when I think there was a comment that you might as well put the forum within the Mental Welfare Commission as anywhere else. We wouldn't see it that way. We'd take a positive view of why the Commission should host this forum. The overall strategic aims of the Commission relate to individual well-being. and enhancing individual well-being and enhancing individuals' rights. And that is very much in line with the strategic aims of the forum. So there's a definite synergy there. Also, the work the Commission does in general in using the individual's experience to A, support that individual, and B, tell a story on the basis of a collection of experiences is very familiar territory to us, and we understand what that involves and what the benefits of that and what some of the risks are in that. So we're well placed to take this on. Plus, we have governance mechanisms, we have information systems, we have support systems, we have risk management systems that the forum can use without having to develop all of these themselves. And again, would be very appropriate to the work of the forum, especially in relation to the security and confidentiality of the information that comes to the forum. If I can also point out, and Lucy maybe expand more on this, because Lucy's been doing the initial project management, the forum's work will be entirely separate from the rest of the work of the Mental Welfare Commission. So the existing Commission staff will not have any responsibility or contact with what is happening within the forum. It sits very, very separately indeed. So it will have its own information system, which the Commission will design and build for it, but to which the rest of the Commission staff won't have access. Having said that, it's important to point out just what the bill actually says. The bill gives the functions of the forum to the Mental Welfare Commission. The Commission then delegates those functions to the forum as a subcommittee. It is for the forum as a subcommittee to exercise those functions, but the Commission has a responsibility for making sure those functions are exercised properly. So, broadly speaking, the way this works out is that the Mental Welfare Commission will be responsible for making sure that the forum is properly governed and managed and delivers what it's set out to be delivering in the legislation. But in terms of the actual evidence that the forum collects and the way the forum reports on that evidence, that is for the forum itself to decide. We're working out the mechanics of that in a memorandum of understanding with the Scottish Government, and I'm certainly very confident that initial discussions are going well in that regard. But that's a sort of ongoing process. I'm just going to ask Lucy if she wants to add to that.
I feel very confident that we can establish them as separate and independent away from the Commission. I'm working closely with the Survivor Scotland team in the Scottish Government, and we are working on all those issues and making sure that we understand all the various issues in terms of staffing and confidentiality and information systems, and they will all be completely separate, and Commission staff will not have access to NCF information and vice versa. There will be no crossover, as we see it, and it will be a completely independent organisation within the Commission. So I feel quite confident in terms of the work we're doing with the Survivor Scotland team that will be the case.
The other issue that was raised was the question of stigmatisation and barrier, for yourselves and for others. Comment on that. Donald?
Thanks, Convener. The intention is that the badging of the National Confidential Forum will not carry a Mental Welfare Commission badge. There will be a lot in the forum to do with the mental health and well-being of the survivors. But there's no intention that this is, when the information goes out from the forum, it will say, National Confidential Forum. It will not say Mental Welfare Commission National Confidential Forum, because we accept that while we certainly want to do all we can to destigmatise mental health issues, that for some people it may be off-putting to see that word up front. So we're comfortable with that as a way forward in dealing with this.
I just want to get some response, Gil, from the initial question from Aileen, from some of the others, if they wish to participate in that part. Have we got any views on the initial question from Aileen and, of course, a response from the Mental Welfare Commission? Kathleen?
I just say, I think having it hosted in a bigger organisation is very helpful. Being very aware, as I am, of all the governance issues, it would be a huge burden for a small outfit like the National Confidential Forum, and I do appreciate everything that they're saying about keeping it separate. I think really on the question of stigmatisation, what came from the witnesses at the last session was important, that they had some concerns about it but thought it could be dealt with. So you know, I think it's basically whatever works here. If the witnesses, the survivors can live with that, then I think the rest of us can. And I certainly myself feel quite comfortable that that's a good location for the confidential forum.
Is that the view of the others, that there are no issues that arise for? Okay, Moira.
I would just be saying, if I would listen to the survivors on that one, because the concerns that I've had, and I have to be honest, it was from professionals rather than from the survivors, was about the possibility of stigmatisation. And about people's confidentiality, exactly the points about emails coming in, about mails coming in, about telephone calls, that it's got to be seen in, entirely separate. But I know some of the professionals that I've been talking to, that was some of the kind of concerns about possible stigmatisation, because people don't see that it's necessarily impacted on their mental health. You know, they just want to talk through it because this is something that happened that should not have happened, and they don't see it as a sort of medical mental health issue at all. So it's sort of keeps a way of distance in that.
And just to re-emphasise what I said earlier, the very clear intention is it's not badged in that way, in a public-facing way. I think it will be very important to have that ongoing dialogue with survivors to make sure they've got that confidence that the hosting arrangements are in line with that. I also say in relation to information security, I would like to think, probably nobody does information security like we do. Because we have so much very sensitive and very confidential individual information that we collect through people phoning us up for advice, through people sending us letters and emails, and us dealing with that. I would be very confident that we can assist the forum in setting up an equally secure and confidential information, and we would expect actually that we already have IT security policies and codes of conduct. We would expect the forum to be following those codes of conduct as well, rather than having to devise one for themselves. So again, that's another good example of why the Mental Welfare Commission in particular is a good host.
Duncan, on this issue?
From our side, the main point is essentially the same one that we made in the framework, the human rights framework on this issue in 2010, that was picked up in the final preparations for the Time to be Heard forum, and it is about the greatest possible functional independence of the body itself, particularly from government. So the memorandum of understanding will be key there in ensuring things like the autonomy of the forum to establish its own procedures, the absolutely clear autonomy of the forum and its chair to agree and publish its final report without any need for oversight or approval, etc. I mean, these are the kinds of headline issues that go to the heart of functional independence.
Moira?
Yeah, so it was just an additional point. When we were supporting setting the human rights framework, there's a document we produced, Time for Justice, and one of the points which some survivors had brought up on that was about the complete independence, that whether it exists in another body or completely standalone, that there should actually be no government representation within the committees and reference groups. So it was the survivors at that point, and that was 2010, but again, it's exactly the same issue about that it should be standalone and, as I say, no government, complete independence from government.
Donald, yes?
I should say this earlier as well. One of the other reasons the Commission was chosen to host this is because of the Commission's independence from government. And the Minister was actually very keen that it was hosted by an organisation that isn't just independent, but is visibly independent. And also has not been and remains not afraid to give some uncomfortable messages to government when we have to do so.
Okay, before I give Aileen the opportunity to come back up, Gil, did you want to follow up
Yeah, I think I've maybe got the answers.
You've
Can,
got-
can I
Yes.
just maybe push it just a wee bit further, coming from a slightly different direction? Knowing that people, this is a long journey for people, and the first step to recovery could well be the NCF, and I just wondered, not from the Commission itself, but from other people around the table, if they were comfortable that this would not be a barrier, that people would still walk through the door, are they sufficiently comfortable that we could make this work in the way it's been suggested?
Tom?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always tempting to go for maximum independence, but having similarly experience of a small, independent public body balancing the responsibilities that all of that brings, I think it makes sense to be hosted by another public body. On the issue of the badging, of the appearance of the National Confidential Forum, I'm actually reassured by what's actually been said. It appears as if there will be a National Confidential Forum, and in the background you'll get all of the assistance from an independent public body. And I would reiterate Donny's call for the rehabilitation of the word mental, but this isn't the way to do that. This is a National Confidential Forum that will look like an independent body.
A couple of questions then in terms of independence. This will be done within the existing budget, or will it come with additional monies in terms of setting up and designing the processes, ensuring that the appropriate support is there for people entering the system, and will that be carried out within the existing budget, or will there be
There's an additional budget given for the NCF.
There is an additional budget?
Yeah.
Has that been agreed?
Yes.
And that can meet all of your aspirations about supporting people through this process, language, and some of the other issues that have.
I mean, some of it will need to be tested out. We've agreed budget for start-up costs and an ongoing running budget on the basis of what we anticipate the need might be, but we have to review that as time goes on.
And in terms of who will sit on that forum, what would be the mechanism there in the process there to ensure that they are seen as being independent?
Head of the forum and members will be public appointments, and then the staffing will be done through the Commission.
How many staff do you envisage?
Initially, there will be budget for the head of the forum, and we are thinking probably 2 members initially. And then in terms of staffing, that's yet to be decided, but there will be there's probably 3 or 4 staff at the initial stage, and then it depends. It's, I guess, a bit unknown as to take up, as to how many people want to come forward, and therefore that will determine how many staff, but probably 3 or 4 support staff at the moment, as well as the head of the forum and the members.
What is your anticipated take-up? What do you think the demand will be in the first, second year? Do you see that rising? I presume that you have some notion of, or some estimation of, how many people will avail themselves to this process, and then on that you've projected some budgets and staffing levels. So what do you expect to take up to be?
We haven't done that. That's come from the Survivor Scotland team have
Right.
projected that and done the budget based on that, so that's not come from the Commission.
Right. And what is that expected take up?
Can't recall offhand. Louisa's sitting in the back. We probably know better than I do. What we've been looking to have probably 4 evidential sessions per week once this is up and running fully, from recollection, with maybe so that would be what, 200 sessions a year, but short of that, given holidays, etc. And probably 2 or 3 people giving evidence to each session. So it's going to be something in the region of between 1,000 and 2,000 people a year who could give evidence to the forum. The issue actually is going to be a more complex one than that, because it's going to be how you prioritise people who come and give evidence to the forum. Because there may be, once people hear it's up and running, there may be quite a demand for it. So you then have to do we do it on a sort of age basis or geographical basis? All these things have still to be worked through.
Mm-hmm. It's a big number, and 3 times a week for a committee meeting weekly. You know, we know the strain of that ourselves, you know, as a committee, but that's significant. It surprises me, those numbers. Moira?
Yes, I just want to say, and I'm having to remember this one here, Donny, but Professor Kendrick and I were commissioned by Scottish Government to do a scoping exercise for the National Confidential Forum. And looking at the Irish scenario and extrapolating and looking at that at the Scottish one, I think we reckoned that in Ireland there was less than half of 1% of people who've been through care actually came to the confidential forum. And I think we reckoned that we might be talking about, very crudely, about 1,500 when we were, that might want to come through it.
So it was a bit higher than that.
Was it?
Maybe about 2,000 or 3,000.
2 or 3, right? I mean,
from recollection, but you know, I don't have those figures.
But as I say, that was purely academic, having worked out the number of people from 1930 till now, projected possible, you know, who's still alive, and percentages coming through. So yeah, you can talk about that.
It's not something we need to resolve. It's not something. I'm sorry, it wasn't a trick question. It's not something that we need to resolve today. But I think, you know, in terms of future sessions or discussions with the Minister, it's something that we can discuss, because I think it does raise other issues in terms of access, delays, waiting to go there, whether and you know, the committee or the forum meets in a central place, or whether it's available you know, in different parts of the, you know, I think there's a whole range of questions that may be asked there in terms of that. Alan?
Yeah, just to raise an additional point as to how the bill, I think, as currently drafted, could be amended to make it clearer and assist the Mental Welfare Commission in being the house for the National Confidentiality Forum. That the Mental Welfare Commission clearly is a public body and has obligations, like all public bodies under the Human Rights Act, that where credible allegations come of criminal conduct, that it has a duty to refer them to the appropriate authorities, i.e. the police. And the way the bill is currently drafted is it gives discretion to the members of the NCF that they may choose to do that. But unlike, say, the situation in Northern Ireland, where it's a must-do because they recognise that it's a public authority with these obligations, then from the point of view of the relationship between NCF and the Mental Welfare Commission, I think the bill could make that easier for the Mental Welfare Commission to ensure that both it and the NCF was acting in accordance with the obligations they have of reporting credible allegations of serious harm and abuse to children. And I think from the point of view of those who would consider going to the NCF, they have to be made very, very clear by the NCF as to what the expectations are that they should have, that if in the course of them giving their testimony they do make allegations against an institution or an individual, that they should understand what may then happen as a result of that, i.e. that information may be reported to the police, and that will change the character of the experience that they will have. So the need for as much clarity as possible for the NCF, for the Mental Welfare Commission, and most importantly for those survivors who want to come to the NCF, the bill leaves that a little bit too vague, too ill-defined, and therefore the expectations might not be what actually happens to survivors.
I think Jennifer, I was going to return to this, I think Jennifer alluded to some of the powers, and, you know, and I think we need to, you know, I think you've went on to that, but Aileen, were you happy with the discussion? Did you wish to follow up in any of the aspects that came from your original question? Thank you. I mean, I think, you know, I think Alan's taken us on to slightly different territory, and it kind of aligns some of that with some of the evidence at a different level about our previous witness session, and I'm sure you read it, where people felt that their testament. Now, I don't know where this is the confidentiality thing, you know, and powers, and the possibility of prosecution, a criminal prosecution coming out of that testament. But at another level, people were saying, were angered at the evidence that they brought to the forum, which was not then communicated at the end of that story. So for me, that's this battle between the confidentiality that may encourage people to get into this process. At the other end, if they felt that they were going to be part of a criminal prosecution, or indeed too much of what they said appears in public at a later date or on a website. So it's a difficult balance that maybe you can help the committee understand and come to a view. Alan's led with this, others. I don't know whether there's any response or reaction to what Alan said, or indeed what I've said, or our previous witnesses have said. Jennifer, you alluded to that earlier in terms of the powers. Do you wish to comment?
I do have some comments, but actually I saw that Kathleen was going to speak, and perhaps from that...
I was just trying to spread it around, so...
Would you like me to go first? I do have... I think it's a really difficult... It's a tension that exists within the forum, and there's no doubt about it. I apologise to the committee for belabouring this, but had a wider strategy been laid out from the very beginning, it would make much more sense, and we would, I think, be much more comfortable with moving into the idea of this forum when there were other remedies for justice that were also available. So ultimately, I believe the source of this tension is because there's a lack of justice remedies anywhere else. And the timing of this is very unfortunate because of that, and also because of the risk that it may raise people's expectations of what this forum will achieve when there's such a gap of other remedies that... So in the context of that, I suppose what will be really important from as I understand it, will be how data is held, and how not just the powers, but what are the parameters of this forum. And if I might just make a couple of comments about that. The first is the bill has proposed that there will be a commitment to ensuring there's a permanent record and to public access to information in relation to this. There's reference to the NCF producing reports, and I'd like to suggest that reports that are very generic will be far less powerful for the actual evidence that's being provided. And I would suggest two things. One is that stakeholders, all range of stakeholders, certainly survivors as a central point, but also stakeholders who are interested in shaping the future of the care system, all of those players will have an interest in what is coming out of the forum in order for a number of different purposes. So I would suggest that before there's even agreement about how this forum progresses, that there are stakeholders who come together to be able to inform what that data needs to look like and the way in which those powers are formed. The second thing to say is the idea that the importance of archiving and preserving what's being gathered is essential, including the opportunity for survivors to come later and come back to review what record it is that they've put to the forum will be very important. And I recognise that establishing the forum in legislation has been an important step towards being able to create more safeguards around that data. But this is very, very important data because it's not just a historical record, but it's a personal record. So I feel I haven't necessarily got to the nugget of what you've really been looking for, which is the powers of the forum. But I think ultimately the powers need to be seen in the context of wider legal remedies, and without that, there will be very big risks in relation to the forum going forward.
I think it was helpful to broaden that out. Duncan?
Yeah, I was just going to... I think there's 2 points. One and they're both important but also distinct. The first is based on the previous evidence session. I'm sure the committee were as struck as I was by the discussion around anonymity, which is not the same as confidentiality. And while there may be benefits in a confidential forum, that doesn't necessarily require anonymity in the testimony at the end of the process. And I think the experience of the Ryan report in Ireland, for example, using coded references to survivors' testimonies might be something to consider, so that individuals can identify where their experience has been directly reflected in the final report. But the main point that I wanted to make was building on the discussion around the limits of confidentiality and the duty to investigate or to pass credible information related to criminal activity to the investigating authorities, and I think there may be some debate about this, because in the process of finalising the report of time to be heard, and I note that there is reference to this question and to the points that we had raised about that in the sections from page 100 onwards, and I think this is quite an important issue that the Parliament ensures has been fully considered before the bill is enacted into legislation. And one of the reasons that we referred explicitly in our written evidence to the process of finalising the equivalent bill in Northern Ireland is that this question arose, that advice was sought, and that the answer that was given is quite clear. It says, and this is a direct quote from the parliamentary record, statutory framework requires that where allegations of child abuse come to light, these must be reported immediately to the police service in Northern Ireland. In reviewing the evidence that we gathered and finalising the human rights framework, we hosted in the final stages a round table with representatives of similar processes in different countries, including Ireland, and it was there made clear that the interaction between the Confidential Committee and the Investigations Committee in Ireland was key to addressing this issue. And I think this is where the anomaly in our process is at its sharpest, that there are few, if any, equivalent processes around the world that have focused solely on a confidential committee without the additional elements of addressing the Limitations Act in terms of civil litigation, although we have a separate government-led consultation on that in Scotland. It may or may not address the issue of time bar for survivors of historic child abuse, and or an investigations or inquiry model, and or other options in terms of a reparations fund. As it stands at the moment, the time bar effectively blocks access to civil justice for survivors of historic child abuse in Scotland. Criminal injuries compensation is only available to those whose experience was after 1964 and criminal, which might not extend to serious neglect. And there is no national reparations fund at present, or some of the other measures that have happened in other countries, notably the inquiry and investigation model that's being set up right now in Northern Ireland, or a crime commission in Australia being set up this year, etc. So we have an unusual process, and it becomes most challenging in this issue of the limits of confidentiality. And I think we just put it on the table, note that other countries have addressed this in different ways, note that we have an unusually difficult challenge in that we have not adopted the other measures that other countries have raised, and encourage the Parliament and the Government to seek further clarification on the nature of those responsibilities, and indeed that the Mental Welfare Commission be minded of them also in negotiating with Government.
Yeah, it is very difficult for the committee, being the secondary committee here, to be focusing on the health, outcomes here. But there is another committee, a lead committee working on this as well. So, Kathleen?
Just like Duncan, I think we should draw your attention to pages 101 and 102 of the report, because the Human Rights Commission were very strong. We had quite a lot of discussions about this duty to report when it reached a certain level. And I suppose our concern was, if you had someone whose experience was way far back, so far back that people were dead, the institution had disappeared, there was no real benefit, no real possibility of having a possible investigation, Was it a disproportionate response to report that to the police if the survivor didn't want it? I won't go into that too much because we've set out the issue here and it was unresolved. We didn't have to face that because where there were cases where we felt there should be reports made to the police, we spoke to the survivors involved and they were actually taken forward with the survivors' consent. So we never actually had an issue where we had to make that decision, but I think it's still a live issue as far as I would see. The other issue, just in a different one, about the way individuals' experiences were in the report, it could be, you could have a coding system. I think there was no real reason why there shouldn't have been. I think we were obviously, because of the way Time to be Heard was set up without any statutory support, we were always concerned about confidentiality and piecing things together, etc. But I would think that in a forum that wasn't a pilot, that didn't have an end to it, and where you had the opportunity of more negotiation with the survivors about how their experiences were reported and the extent to which they wanted that reported, then that would be quite simple to do. Some people did say to us they didn't want quoted, or they didn't want quoted without without negotiation and that sort of thing. So, but I think that this is about coding it is a lesson taken from people's comments on the report, and I don't think that should be too difficult to do. And also archiving and preserving, we just had to destroy everything because we had no protection. People were offered the opportunity of coming back to review their testimony, but nobody actually did that. Only one person came back to give us a second session on their testimony. But I did personally feel as well that was a loss. I would like to have been able to have preserved that, but we couldn't do it within the context within which we were operating. But I think that could be important.
Donald?
Yes. Also to remind the committee of another clause in the bill that says that the forum will have a separate record management policy, and it will have to comply with the Data Protection Act. And under Data Protection Act, you can only keep information for so long as it is necessary to keep it. So there may be an issue about whether it can be archived or not, and I think that's something we have to look at when the forum has a policy for that. In relation to the issue about disclosing information to criminal justice, can I point out that responsibility falls on forum members very clearly under the bill. I think it is clear in the bill that forum members have the duty to make that decision, and the forum will have to set some sort of threshold as to what it reports and when. The Commission, as the body to whom the forum is accountable, will have to be comfortable that the forum has appropriate procedures in place for doing that, but it won't be for the Commission as such to decide whether information should or should not be passed on to criminal justice agencies. I think that is fairly clear in the bill, but again, we'll set this out and emphasise this more and work through details more about how the mechanics of that might work in a memorandum of understanding.
Duncan, you want to respond?
Just briefly. I would agree that the responsibility to make that decision might be clear in the bill. The discretion to make it is unlimited as it presently stands. And whether in the bill or in regulations or in the operating procedures, we would certainly look for something a bit clearer than that balances the public interest in having a confidential committee with the state obligation to ensure investigation of crimes, which itself, of course, is in the public interest, that there's criminal prosecution of serious child abuse. And for example, in the earliest iterations of the procedures around the Time to be Heard forum, that appeared to be limited to where there was known to be an ongoing risk to others. But there may be instances where there are corroborated testimony of serious abuse, which the public interest would demand and the public would expect is investigated, whether or not the individual named may or may not have continuing responsibility for the care of children.
we have come to the end of our time. But Sam Bailey, you want to say something? I think Gil Patterson wants to come in.
I think this brings us back to the starting point, which is the purpose and the functions that will be fulfilled by the National Confidential Forum. And it's already been given a strong airing about acknowledgement being satisfied, but redress or investigation or reparation not. And I think it's entirely competent for the Health Committee to actually comment on that, because this is about the health and well-being of the people for whom the National Confidential Forum has been set up. And in many, many instances, we heard earlier that acknowledgement and having their story heard will actually be what people are looking for and feel satisfied with. But you've also heard very strong evidence about how that doesn't go far enough for an unknown number of people. And I suspect it may be a lot more than you've heard from so far. So I think it's entirely competent for the committee to comment on these matters of the purpose and the functions that will actually be fulfilled by the National Confidential Forum and the deficits that it leaves with our current approach.
Gil?
Yeah, I'm trying to reflect on an individual that may want to walk in the door, but don't because they feel that whatever they say will be passed on to the authorities and maybe criminal action takes place, and that's not what they want. And my understanding of Scots law is that there would need to be a complaint unless other evidence was produced. So I wonder, I'm just I'll put it in this phrase, is what I'm feeling, and maybe get comment on it, that maybe it will struck, or the government struck the right level where people who are hearing, if you like, evidence, and they can signpost and give advice to that individual to say what they should do and how it would impact on them, rather than say a prescriptive, you will pass this information on to criminal justice. And I wondered if anyone would like to comment in that regard.
Donald?
I absolutely understand that. I think that's a risk attached to the forum. And that the forum would have to make sure that it's got risk procedures in place to make sure that people who come along are properly briefed and properly understand. And also, if there is a suggestion that the information may be shared with criminal justice, then before the individual goes into the forum, they need to know when that might happen and under what circumstances. That's going to be set out at the outset. Can I very, very quickly correct something I said earlier? I got my maths wrong. If it's 8 people a week, for 50 weeks, it's about 400 people a year, maybe 400 to 500 people a year that might be the opportunity to give evidence to the forum. This shows why I was a complete failure on countdown.
Duncan, quickly.
One very briefly to that direct question. I think 2 things. Firstly, as the Time to Be Heard report notes, we had suggested that the practice that the UN Convention Against Torture would require should be considered, and that would be not that a formal complaint needs to be made, that if a report is made to a public body of a credible allegation of serious ill treatment, that in itself triggers the duty to respond on behalf of the public authority under the Human Rights Act and under international standards. And of course that requires clarifying exactly for people before they go in when that would happen, so that they're aware of exactly what they're going to do.
Yeah, I completely recognise Gil's concern, and I think it echoes what Jennifer was saying, that we have to make sure that we no longer force individuals to try and find a way of fitting into a system. The system has to be adapted so that individual survivors have the choice. If they want to have criminal proceedings looked at, if they want simply to have a confidentiality forum where that doesn't take place, if they want reparation, if they want an apology, if they want civility, the system has to be adapted to be person-centred and not the other way around, which is the person finding it very difficult to know what's going to happen, because the only way they can access anything that might meet their needs is not clear, and it's not one of a range of options that is designed to be adapted to suit what they want. And I think that's the tension that we have by only having this one door and not a series of doors that can be the door that the survivor chooses, that he or she wants to go through and knows what's at the other side of the door.
Can I thank the witnesses who have joined us this morning for the written evidence, the evidence that they've provided this morning. encourage you to recognise that this is an ongoing process, just as you looked at last week's evidence and you've expressed some opinions on that. We would encourage you to, if you see further evidence in further sessions that you strongly agree with, strongly disagree with, then that we ask you to continue to participate in that process through the clerks, and if there are issues that you haven't been able to raise today, you felt were important, or issues that arise out of further sessions, please continue to communicate with us through this inquiry process. But can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you all for your attendance and the evidence that you provided this morning. We suspend at this point while we clear the table and get our next panel. Thank you very much. we're all sitting comfortably. We'll now move to our second panel of the morning on the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill. And can I welcome the guests today? And as a panel, I'll introduce myself as Duncan McNeill, MSP, Greenock and Inverclyde, and convener of the Health and Sport Committee.
I'm Lorna Patterson. I'm from In Care Survivors Service Scotland, which is a national organisation for people who've been abused in care.
Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
I'm Joan Johnson from Health in Mind, which is a mental health charity which has specialist supports for survivors, but also we know we work with a lot of people who are survivors, but that's not the particular reason they come to us.
Good morning, Alan McCloskey. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of Victims Support Scotland. We look after victims of crime in both the community and in the court process.
Drew Smith, member for Glasgow.
Linda Waters, I'm the team leader of the Survivor Scotland team, which is responsible for the national strategy for adult survivors of childhood abuse, which was launched in 2005.
Gil Patterson, member for Clydebank and Milngavie.
Mark MacDonald, member for North East Scotland.
Louise Carlin, I'm the Bill team leader for the National Confidential Forum provisions in the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill.
David Torrance, MSP, Kirkcaldy constituency.
Annette Milne, MSP for North East Scotland.
Aileen MacLeod, MSP for the South of Scotland.
Thanks everybody and welcome. Slightly different this session in terms of the panel and the issues, and maybe just to open it up, we could I ask a question just in terms of the demand? And I think we had asked in the last session about how many people we expect to take this up, and the discussion may flow from that about how we support people that would do it back to front. But has the work been done in terms of how many people we expect to present to the panel?
In preparation for the consultation, we looked at numbers, and we looked at numbers that came forward for the Irish Commission, both the investigation and the confidential committee, and we expected about 2,000 people to come forward for this, based on their numbers. We have done some work around investigating how many people were in care through a number of years, and that supported that level of number coming forward. Mm-hmm.
And I suppose, we are creating a demand and expectation. So how will that be managed in terms of the resources? I think there was some confidence that the resources that are in place will meet that level of demand. But the other issues of supporting people through that process, the pre-hearing, support through it, some people vulnerable, difficulties in communication, I think some of these issues were raised as well.
For time to be heard, we had support in place for people who came forward before, during and after they came to the hearings. In fact, Lorna's organisation, In Care Survivors Service Scotland, were part of that. And we have had discussions at the at consultation events and as part of the consultation on what kind of support survivors themselves would like, and there have been a range of suggestions. Some people support one organisation, but the majority of people wanted to be able to choose their own support. So in the finances we have put in place finance for support to be available for survivors who come forward for the National Confidential Forum. There are a range of organisations already who receive funding for different areas under the Survivor Scotland strategy, which is over and above the money that's been set aside for support as part of the National Confidential Forum.
Anybody else get any other? Yep, thanks. Lorna?
as Linda was saying, In-Care Survivors was one of the organisations that supported people, but what we feel going forward and picking up the lessons that have been learned is that talking to survivors or talking to people who want to go through the consultation beforehand is really important. And I think that's because what people have told us in our service is that when they went into the consultation, they were expecting to feel relief and to be listened to, and they received that, but they hadn't anticipated the trauma effects that may come after the consultation. So what we've seen is that some people felt almost euphoric, and I think that was discussed in one of the first evidence forums, that people felt that was great, it had made a difference, they felt really positive, and then actually they were triggered several months later. Now, not everybody, but some people were. So I think that the idea of having a choice of support services is right, and I think going in with some informal support with counsellors to let people know what their expectations, what might happen, and to set some expectations of the different range of feelings that can happen is really important. And what we've found is that by then you've started to build a relationship, and we know that for some survivors issues of trust is very difficult. So we've got that initial relationship, and what people have told us in forums as well is that to offer the counselling and some level of advocacy as a one-stop shop in one organisation is really important, partly because of the issues of trust, but partly because they've started to build a relationship up, and so the counsellor can offer the advocacy at the same time. They don't have to manage relationships with multiple people. They can have one person through the whole process. So I think that that would be an option, and to put more emphasis on setting expectations of what can happen before, during and after. And I noticed in the first evidence forum that there was a suggestion that people would need support, counselling support, for about a year after the consultation, and our experience is at least 2 years. We're still working with people who participated in Time to Be Heard, and we really think that when you're looking at long-term trauma, that 2 years is a more reasonable option.
Any other views on that, Louise?
I think just to add to what Linda said, we heard very, very loudly and clearly in the consultation on the NCF in particular, which has informed discussions with the Mental Welfare Commission in developing the Memorandum of Understanding, is that people want a choice. So what we did as best we could in advance of the forum actually being up and running is to look at, as Linda said, anticipated demand based on other fora, and then looked at the kind of average costs, if you like, of people going through Time to Be Heard. And within that, we hope that we've kind of set a provisional budget, if you like, that within that there can be flexibility and that people can choose. Because I think we have to bear in mind that not everyone coming forward to the forum will have experienced abuse or neglect. 20% of people who came forward to Time to Be Heard actually had wholly positive experiences of quarriers. So we'll hear a spectrum of experiences, and I imagine there'll be a spectrum of needs and desires for support, information, advocacy, right up to no requirement or need for support, information and advocacy. So we've had to kind of, I suppose, shape the budget and the MOU at this stage to enable that degree of flexibility when the forum's up and running.
Anyone else? Yes, Joan?
My thinking is, having not been involved in the Time to Be Heard, but that we certainly work in Health and Mind with a lot of people who have been looked after in care and who have experiences of serious trauma. And it may be that some people coming forward to the forum would want to use the support that they currently have in place already, because it will be people who trust and who they already have a good relationship with. And I think it's taking account of the fact that for other agencies there might be quite an additional demand on their resources because of this, which is an excellent opportunity, but would certainly agree that people often, I think it's true of all of us, don't anticipate the outcome that's going to come from something that just has a positive feel at the start. But if we're thinking of people who've been looked after and in care many decades ago, then the coping mechanisms that are in place will potentially be dismantled by this process, and therefore the support that they need, whoever that comes from, will, I would agree, need to be over a longer period rather than a shorter period of time to help people to then rebuild structures that help them continue with their lives in a positive way, which hopefully they've been doing up until then.
Alan?
Thank you. We see the forum having or being an effective remedy for some people, but not all. It is one, I think, of a range of options that needs to be available for people. It was mentioned earlier about trust and developing that trust. Whether somebody's experienced a trauma, having been in residential care previously, they were in somewhere as a child that they believed they could trust. And we're asking people now to go back into a forum and say, trust us. And the whole issue about the confidentiality of the forum in terms of what may or may not be disclosed, I think is hugely significant for people and may actually deter people from coming forward. And I think in terms of the numbers of people, we've already heard that maybe 2,000 a year may come forward. It may be more than that. We actually don't know. Because many people who have experienced trauma, have experienced neglect, may not want to actually tell anybody and may never have told anybody about their experience to date. So having a forum gives somebody a voice, and for some people will be seen as empowering, and that's hugely significant. But there'll be other people who want to come into the forum to have their say, and it might not be enough for them. There might be something else that's missing. Whether it be access to justice, whatever is missing, they will feel, I've had my say, but now what? What is next? And I think that's the gap.
Anyone else? Members? Mark?
It would just be to pick up on the earlier theme that I raised around the support services that are available, and we heard witnesses in the first session who wanted to see some form of advocacy built into the process. I raised the point there that advocacy can be defined in different ways. There's obviously independent advocacy services. There are people who you would consider a trusted individual, maybe a family member, maybe a friend, and there's also the need for people to be given the power to self-advocate if they feel that is something they wish to do. The view was raised during the previous evidence session that the pre-brief that will take place in advance of any appearance before the National Confidential Forum ought to help identify the needs that a person will have. There are obviously some who will have a statutory right to advocacy under legislation, but will help to identify the needs people will have, and that should take care of everything. I just wonder what this panel's view would be. Are they confident that process will allow for all needs to be captured in terms of the kind of support that people will need when it comes to appearing before the National Confidential Forum?
Anyone? Joan?
Certainly one of the things in our work that's having major impact is peer support and peer mentoring, which is somebody with a similar, not the same experience, who's moved on in their thinking and in their life, but will go through training, actually supports another person. So, for example, my thinking about this was somebody who's an in-care survivor supporting another person, because it gives a credibility that is difficult for professionals sometimes to offer if that's not been our life experience. And I would like to see that considered as an option for people. It may have been discussed already, I don't know, but certainly we know that people using our services really value that fact that the person alongside them is somebody whose experiences have been shaped in a similar way.
Just picking up on Mark's point and Jordan's point, I think really it's about choice, as everybody's been saying. It's about a choice of services, and I know the last round of witness input talked about independent advocacy, and I don't disagree with the concept of independent advocacy, but if there is going to be a choice, then I think we also need to think about the types of organisations that can offer an advocacy that is joining up their different needs. So the organisation in Ireland, Toward Healing, has set it up where there's counselling and advocacy runs alongside each other, and I just want to put out there that actually that is what survivors are telling us. I understand that not everybody will be a survivor, but for the people who are a survivor of in-care abuse, they're telling us in the organisation that they would prefer it to be a one-stop advocacy and counselling support service, and then they go on to do what you were suggesting, which is service user groups, peer groups that can really be helpful to giving them a sense of community. And the types of advocacy that we would anticipate might be something around help with access to records, which can also end up being quite a therapeutic process and a traumatic process and a positive process. So that would be one example, but out of the consultation, the people we've worked with have also gone on to want to meet with other organisations, health professionals, GPs, housing. So there's a lot come out of the result of actually finding their voice in a consultation. So it's that type of advocacy that I think we're talking about. And what we sometimes find is that advocacy agencies refer back to us because it's very difficult for some people to separate out their advocacy needs with their therapeutic needs. Some can, but some can't, and I think that brings us back to the point about it being a choice.
Yes, Alan?
The question was around the needs and the needs of the participants, and I think for it to be effective, to be truly effective, whatever happens has to be centred around the person. Otherwise, people will feel perhaps they're being put through a process and they're being taken to it, things will be taken from them, and then they'll come out the other side. And I think unless it's centred around what their needs are, and people's needs change, so they might think at one particular time what it is that they want and what they need, they have to be in control. They have to feel they're in control of this. And if they're not in control and things are being done to them, then individually and collectively, I think there are risks associated with that. So that has to be catered for.
Louise?
That's why we took great care with our consultation to make sure that we heard the range of views, particularly on the issue of support before, during and after participation in the forum, of people who may consider participating in the forum, including survivors. And you'll be aware from your briefing that through the Survivor Scotland strategy, we invest a significant amount of money in current service provision, and we're instrumental in helping to set up ICS and supporting other agencies. In addition to that, and what we heard through the consultation was that there might be particular barriers faced by particular groups, and that we should do some work now to explore what those barriers might be and what specific supports should or perhaps should not be put in place to enable effective participation. And in particular, people with learning disabilities and people with mental health issues came up quite strongly. And what we've done is fund different consortia of organisations to look at those issues, particularly in relation to the model of acknowledgement, and what barriers might exist, what services already exist to help support people through this new process, and perhaps where gaps are. So in advance of the forum being set up, we're trying to do as much as we possibly can to look at the range of supports that are already there, what we currently fund, and where there might be gaps indeed.
Yes, Lynn.
Coming back to Alan's point, it is quite clear that it's about the needs of the person going forward to the forum, and actually a lot of the services that we currently fund are around particular needs. For example, one of the areas that we funded in the past few years is around male survivors, because male survivors felt that they needed a different kind of service, that some of the issues for them were different than they were for female survivors, and so we fund specific projects to do with male survivors. Also, in the past few years, we've been working with Roshni to set up the Ethnic Survivors Forum, because the voices of survivors from ethnic minority backgrounds weren't being picked up. So it's quite important that we continue to do that around, as Alan says, person-centred.
Mark? Bob?
Well, I think I can maybe come back to something we looked at in the first panel, convener, and that was over eligibility criteria to take part in the National Confidential Forum, and the point was made about maybe for some people who would qualify because they had a period in residential care, but perhaps the abuse potentially took place in a foster setting as well, and just that would be someone who, in theory, the National Confidential Forum, you could talk about your residential care experience, but perhaps not the foster care experience. And of course, that's just one group who kind of partly fall into the criteria, but others who may have been through a number of foster carers as looked after children, the National Confidential Forum wouldn't be open to them. I'm just wondering people's thoughts in relation to the eligibility criteria.
Louise?
I think first of all to say that the bill makes provision for institutional care. That might seem a bit of a pedantic difference, but it's broader than residential care provision, a provision that's been provided on a residential basis to children. So it is anticipated it will be much broader than time to be heard and broader than residential care, so will encompass long stay hospital provision and potentially other forms of provision. So that's the kind of first thing. In terms of trying to almost dissect people's experiences in the way you suggest, I would certainly hope that when the forum is up and running, as with time to be heard, that the commissioners would take a pragmatic view of that, and certainly wouldn't be saying to people, well, you were in a particular institution for a period of time and then in foster care, we can only hear this one experience. The focus of the forum will largely be on people's experience of care, but that doesn't necessarily exclude other experiences, including potentially abuse at home, or, you know, so people will be coming to talk about their lived experiences. And as with time to be heard, I don't imagine that the commissioners will be taking a very prescriptive view of what people can and can't say, but will be very much encouraging people to talk about what they want to talk about, what they feel is important. So from that perspective, I would certainly hope, in terms of the interpretation of the bill and hopefully becomes an act, that the commissioners wouldn't be taking that strict view.
Any other views on the eligibility? Yeah, Joan?
I mean, it certainly does
Alan?
raise possibilities, because residential care used to be much more the norm than it is currently, and certainly children are placed in a whole range of different family options. The drive over the decades that I've been involved in social care and social work was to move away from residential care. So I think it will raise, just hearing the previous discussion, it will raise potentially different issues as well in terms of key identifiable people. If it's a family situation that a young person's been placed in and they're reporting abuse, then that's a very clear line to one or two people, as opposed to a residential unit where there's multiple potential people. So I think it potentially raises a lot of issues, but I think it's really important, because coming into care, as it used to be said, was coming into all sorts of different care situations, and it could be feel really excluded. Some people could feel really excluded if it's, well, your care situation isn't the one we're looking at. So I'd welcome that.
Alan?
I would echo Louise's comments around hoping that the scope is not so narrow that it forces people to either be in or out because of wherever they happen to be. And it should be the case that the commissioners are given the openness to include and actually to listen to what people have got to say, regardless of whether or not it fits the criteria. And if we make the process too rigid, I think we're in danger of actually saying to somebody, we don't want to hear your voice. And I think that we have to allow people to have their say and have their voice. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yes.
Add to that, I think it's fair to say that provision in the bill is very expansive around eligibility. It was intended to be, so a focus on institutional care in a very broad sense, placed in any form of that care at any period of time and for any length of time. So there's no prescription around when you were placed in care or how long you were there, trying to be a kind of very wide approach. But I think, as the policy memo sets out, the focus on institutional care is to reflect an evolution from time to be heard, so we know that the Acknowledgement Forum works for people placed in particular forms of care. and that there are, particularly on a historical basis, distinct aspects of the forms of institutional care that are in addition to any abuse or neglect that may have been experienced. So the starting point is about the context within which people were placed in care, not the fact of abuse or neglect. And I think that's important to bear in mind. Having said that, we're not necessarily saying that this model wouldn't be of benefit to other people. So one of the things we're doing, again, we're funding, as was said in the previous session, we're funding Celsius and others to look at the area of foster care and whether this is something that a model that could, or who knows, might work for people placed in foster care. And I think also the recognition that children move between different types of care. That's not unusual. So we are exploring that area, but we don't want to just leap into something, I suppose, that we don't have a lot of evidence to say that it works or doesn't. And with Time to Be Heard, we have evidence that it works for people placed in institutional care as children.
Lorna?
I was thinking about the issue of eligibility and also support, and thinking about people in Scotland, but we're supporting, for example, someone in Spain who was abused in Scotland, and so we're doing remote advocacy for this person who's currently living in Spain, and there are several people in England as well. So I was thinking about just being clear about the eligibility, that obviously, to state the obvious, you don't have to be living in Scotland to participate, and what we do about offering support for people who are not currently living in Scotland, whether it's therapeutic support or advocacy support like the example that I just gave, and also helplines attached to that will be important as well.
Okay, well, the other piece of eligibility was, and we had a discussion about earlier, was about the age and access to that. And we've settled on 18. There's a discussion this morning about changing, legislation and encouraging people to be in a care setting for a longer period of time. This is something that needs to be addressed. Something at 17. Can't use this system, is that? Anyone got a view on that in terms of the age? Eligibility. You don't have to have it, it was just, there was some discussion earlier. No strong views on that. In terms of, Louise, do you wish to say something?
You've already, as you said, had a letter from the Minister on that point. I think all I would add to that is the person who instructed the bill is that there are different options in terms of age, as Tam Bailey pointed out. I think he's well placed to kind of make comment about that. And we looked at those different options, 16, 18, 21, 25, and the law currently makes provision, for children becoming adults and for different ages and different contexts. And I suppose we thought that you're more likely to be in care if you're under 18, so your experience will not be current. So we want to enable the forum to focus on past experiences, and you will be more likely to have a past experience of care if you're over 18. So it was trying to balance, the resources of the NCF, its focus on, who's most likely to come forward. And actually, in relation to that, in terms of our consultation, most responses were more concerned with the older age group, that people have access to the forum, in particular before they die or not able to participate. And that also came up in Time to Be Heard. And I think that will be a question for the commissioners to determine priorities and how they facilitate maximum access to the forum for people of all ages.
Why are we having a bill? I'm starting to ask the question about why we're having a bill if we'll do a bill, but it'll be up to the commissioners about the extent and the flexibility of this, and age, we'll just leave that. Why are we not dealing with these issues?
Well, we are. There is provision for age in the bill, and there's provision for eligibility. and there's provision for lots of things in the bill. The main reason why we're having primary legislation is because it's required to enable the protections to be put in place for participants and also the commissioners to fulfil the functions of the forum. As Kathleen Marshall pointed out in the previous evidence session, time to be heard was set up on an informal basis. It is possible, but there are significant risks involved in that. And one of their main recommendations, which is set out very clearly in the Time to be Heard report, is that any future forum going forward had to be based on primary legislation. And what we've done is I suppose, as all bill teams do, is judge what should go in the legislation and what can be left for, you know, operational agreements, for example, with the Mental Welfare Commission. But you'll see in the bill the functions are set out, eligibility criteria is set out, there's a new duty of confidentiality, there's a number of provisions that we feel very strongly should be set out in primary legislation, so people are absolutely clear. And in particular that we can give protections to participants, for example, absolute protection from the threat of action for defamation. That wouldn't be possible if we didn't have primary legislation.
Mm-hmm. Is it not important then, if you're leading the bill team in the government, that if you feel that it could and should be extended to foster or whatever, then that should be set out in the bill? It should be made clear to the commissioners that they've got that right to extend it beyond residential. If many of the witnesses that we've heard saying that it's about the person that should be able to avail themselves of this and other remedies, that they shouldn't be excluded by the nature of the care they found themselves in, or necessarily by age. Are these not fundamental to?
Well, the government's taken a decision to define the eligibility to participate in the forum in a particular way, with a focus on institutional care based on evidence of what works, the views of many consultations before the consultation we did in the National Confidential Forum. So a decision was made about that, and that is an expansion from residential care and from the scope of the Time to be Heard forum. What we're also doing, because we have heard, I would say, a minority of views in relation to foster care, is fund a bit of work to explore that. We didn't get a lot of feedback from participants that there was a demand for this type of model within the arena of foster care, but nonetheless, there have been views expressed to that effect, so we want to explore that. Mm-hmm. There have also been a range of other views expressed, and I suppose we've taken a decision to say we have evidence that this works, and we'll make provision to that effect in the bill.
And we also heard from Children First that there are thousands of children in Scotland being reported to the Children's Panel, and indeed put into protection because they're suffering from either direct or indirect sexual abuse. So given, of course, it is a historical thing, the residential, the quarriers and these types of institutions, sexual abuse and trauma are taking place in the other environments that currently exist. So, I mean, yes, Bob? Alan?
Sorry, Alan, do you want to come in first?
I was just going to add to that. I mean, you're absolutely right. Whether somebody is 16, 17 or 18, to a large extent, if they are suffering and they have suffered abuse, is it right that actually 18 is the criteria in terms of eligibility? Because we support children who go through the court system who are 14, 15, 16, who are victims of crime, and they might have been victims 4, 5, 6 years ago previously. So it could be too narrow just to say, well, 18 and you're in. If you're not 18, I'm sorry, you'll have to wait till you're 18. You are actually denying people their right to have their voice. So I actually do think that does need to be considered. And maybe it's too tight to say 18 is the criteria.
I think we have to reflect what Tam Bailey said, that there are current, and Kathleen Marshall, there are current systems, legislation in place for children who are looked after, who are under 18 at the moment. And if those don't give children the confidence to come forward, then we need to look at those. And, I think Tam suggested that there be some discussion about, what's happening in that current world at the moment, and what learning could be applied from the National Confidential Forum to that. But rather than saying, well, the National Confidential Forum should extend its remit to address the fact that children who are currently looked after under 18 feel they can't come forward, might be missing the point a bit. And also we have to, if it's about numbers and about abuse, which is not what the National Confidential Forum's about, it's about the context within which children were placed in care, then you know the argument is for expanding it to everything. You know, who's to say that there isn't more abuse in private homes as compared with foster care, as compared with institutions? So what we're trying to focus on is the context within which children are placed, and a model that we know works for people placed in institutional care as children, including those who've been abused, but also including people who had positive experience or mixed experiences.
Bob and Drew and Gil.
Convener, I suppose the more I kind of let some of the evidence sink in relation to this, I suppose as long as there's a protocol in place that should someone seek the support of the National Confidential Forum, that they're not going to be told you're not eligible, go away, but they'll be signposted in a sensitive manner to other support agencies and procedures. I think I'm kind of getting content with that, Convener, I have to say, in terms of whether those who suffered abuse in a foster setting are concerned. Again, I'm thinking that the National Confidential Forum came about from a pilot project specific to institutionalised care with an evidence, and again some more information perhaps after in relation to what is happening with looking at how we can take forward any concerns in a foster care setting would be welcome. But I think I do start to get to a situation where it's a case of we need to be led by the evidence rather than put it into this particular bill. But flexibility is the key word that's been mentioned in many an occasion. And to go back to what is actually in this bill, because we do have to scrutinise the specific aspects of this bill, the National Confidential Forum will be able to decide what the nature and dynamic of testimony sessions will look like, how that will be kind of set up. They will be able to decide for themselves in terms of how that's reported. Obviously, confidentiality and anonymity has to be guaranteed, but there's a huge degree of flexibility with the commissioners in relation to how they take that forward. Can I just check with witnesses who are scrutinising the procedures within the bill? Are they content that we've got the flexibility in terms of what testimony sessions and evidence sessions look like and how that's reported back? That the degree of flexibility within the bill is right? Have we got the balance right in relation to that? I do love a period of silence at a committee convener. It is within the bill. We do need to ask these questions. I can only deem by the silence that if people had concerns they would raise them. So when we do go to report convener, that's not something from this session we're going to take from it that there are any concerns. But it was just a matter of we have to go through each of the parts of this bill and give it a health check, if you like, in terms of the scrutiny here. So I raised the question. You had the opportunity to reply if there were any concerns.
Drew?
Thank you, Convener. Just to return to this issue about age eligibility, I mean, the concern I have is we're putting in place a system where, obviously we want to respect the individuals and the individual circumstances within it, but then we're trying to apply an eligibility that captures and therefore also excludes people in groups rather than as individuals. So, and I think in the response we had about that, we talked about, because there may be issues for young people who remain in care. But what about for those people for whom both the abuse and the relationship with care is historical? So someone could have been in care at a much earlier age, could have suffered abuse there, and at the age of 16 or 17 feels that they want to resolve some of these issues and take advantage of this process. And Bob Doris mentioned the flexibility in what then is the support, what is the signpost we give. So I just wonder, can anybody take me through what then happens to that person other than just being told you need to wait 2 years before we can deal with that? Because that person may be starting at work, they may be thinking about becoming a parent. There may be a whole range of reasons why they would actually rather resolve it at that point. why should we stop them?
Lorna.
If the limit is starting at 18 and you're talking about someone who's maybe 17, for example, who is now ready to talk about their experiences where they weren't earlier, then I would imagine that one of the things that could happen is for them to be signposted to other organisations. I'm not here to promote, but to other organisations and to InCare, because we work with 16-year-olds and above. So I know that doesn't address the below 16s, and there are other agencies that do that, but we work specifically with people abused in care settings, including fostering, adoption and kinship. So where it might be that the person who's not 18 can't participate in the forum as it stands at the moment, if they require other support and the trigger for participating was because they wanted to address their issues, then I'm sure the forum would signpost an organisation like ourselves or other organisations.
Anyone else? Linda?
We do fund some organisations at the moment who provide services for younger people. In fact, we've just provided some funding in the last couple of months to an organisation who are dealing with young people and homelessness, and also to an organisation dealing with issues around drugs and alcohol. So that the Survivor Scotland strategy is published, and there is a website which is set up and owned really, and it was owned and set up by survivors when it was back in 2005. And we list all these organisations, but there are, as Lorna says, there are organisations already there who can provide support to people who are under 18.
But you can provide support for those over 18. Are you suggesting that the support that you provide is a substitute for the National Confidential Forum? I mean, that can be said for adults.
Yes, that's right.
You don't need the forum because you're providing that. But that's not what the forum's intended to do. I mean, we're engaging with the establishment, the authority that allowed this to happen. We're challenging. People are challenging this, given their evidence, to get a weight off of their shoulders and indeed inform the authorities of what happened and expect some acknowledgement, apology from that process.
Yeah, no, I wasn't suggesting it was a substitute. I think the question was, would they just be, turned away, or could they be referred anywhere else for support? So that's why I mentioned these organisations.
Could I just ask then, because I mean, I agree, that is then nothing that is additional.
Yes.
It's merely people trying to assist people who don't have anywhere else, to go, which is the situation currently. So that group of people are not benefiting from this bill. So I suppose my question really is a simple one. In terms of eligibility, then why not simply make the eligibility? Well, why not simply say if you are currently being looked after, then you're not able to use this process because there are other facilities available to you to discuss this and to raise your concerns, rather than putting an age at all? Why is that not the eligibility? But it doesn't seem to me to be a difficult thing to do.
Please?
I don't know if I can add anything more to what I've already said. The idea of being clear and using the opportunity of primary legislation to be clear about eligibility was for that purpose, to be absolutely clear. So looking at an age threshold, as I've said, we looked at different options and we chose 18 because it would be more likely that the experience of care would be in the past for people who are 18 years and over. And that's the focus of the National Confidential Forum, mostly articulated at the other end of the spectrum, if you like, in terms of historic abuse. So, decades previously, but we wanted to make sure that younger people could have access to the forum. So actually we thought, for that reason, we discounted 21, we wanted it to be 18. So rather than looking at it from the perspective of why not 16, one of the options we looked at was 21, and we thought actually that might exclude younger people who have more recent experiences of care. So it was a judgment call to set the threshold at 18.
Okay. Gil.
So on that very point, I know that the Confidential Committee in Ireland have set it at 18, and I wondered if we have any evidence from Ireland, or is it too early to see the impact of it in Ireland, and maybe even if Ireland, Northern Ireland picked it, did they have some guidance or some reason to pick 18?
I don't know the specific reasons why they chose that particular threshold. We have liaised closely with colleagues in Northern Ireland as they've set up taken their legislation through and set up their acknowledgement forum. I think it's probably reasonable to assume it was similar reasons for ours, and I think the Confidential Committee in Ireland was 18 as well. Is that right, Linda? Yeah.
Is it too early to have some evidence from that? Are we asking too much? I know it's
Northern Ireland?
From Northern Ireland and Ireland. I know these are recent happenings.
I think so from Ireland, yes. There is a lot of evidence from the experience of the different elements of the Commission in Ireland. And again, we have looked at that as one of the main jurisdictions we've drawn experience from in informing our approach in Scotland.
Mark. And I think the point that Gil Patterson was making there, convener, was: is there evidence from the Republic of Ireland and their experience that there is the exclusion element, that the exclusion element is a factor in terms of those who might be 16, 17? Is there any evidence that the committee could consider as part of its considerations of this legislation, or that the government has seen evidence of, which might give an indication as to whether or not the issues around 16 and 17-year-olds that have been brought up today have manifested themselves in the Republic of Ireland? You don't have to answer today, but if you wanted to come back to the committee, I think it might be beneficial if we could find out whether that has borne any example.
Not that we're aware of, but we can certainly go away and look at that again. That would be helpful to the committee.
Nanette? No. Is there any other questions from committee members at this point? Is there anything from the witness panel that they feel that they would wish to leave with us that hasn't been brought out from the questions as yet? I'm not putting you on the spot, because what you can do that now if anything's in your head that you feel that I want to leave them with that message. Feel free to do that. But as often happens when you get away from here, you're on the bus going home and you say, I wish I had said that. Then the opportunity is still there, not necessarily in this forum. Sometimes that's not always easy, but if there are any issues that you feel on reflection you would wish to come back to us on, feel free to do that. Email the Health and Sport Committee, and indeed we'd ask you to take note of the other sessions that we have had and will have, and if you have any strong views or in terms of support of what has been said, or indeed concerns of what is being said, then please feel free to communicate with us. We will take that into account in our final conclusions before we report. But if there's no committee members wish to ask other questions, if there's no witnesses that want to place anything on the record at this point, no? Can I thank you then for your attendance this morning and the evidence you provided, and we look forward to hearing from you and throughout the process. Thanks very much. Can we suspend at this point while we clear the room and we'll go to our next session? Thanks, folks. Move to agenda item number 4, which is further consideration of the petition PE 1434. The committee, as you will recall, looked at this in December and agreed to write to the various parties. We now have those responses. Do members have any comments? We've got links to the responses, including the letter from the Minister, the early spice briefings, and confirmation from the Scottish Government that school premises, general regulations and standards, and the regulations that apply to all the schools. Yes, Nanette.
I just feel that the responses should be able to give satisfaction to the petitioners, and I don't know if we can take it any further than it's gone.
Any other points of view on that? No other comments? Are we agreeing then that we no longer wish to proceed with the petition? Are we agreed? Thank you. We now go on to, as we have previously agreed, to private session to discuss our NHS Board's scrutiny. Thank you.